Hello, Mr. Prestowitz. Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. I'm so great to have you here with us. So, Mr. Prestowitz, you're currently the founder and president of the Economic Strategy Institute. But before that, you served as counselor to the Secretary of Commerce in the Reagan administration and also took leadership role in trade negotiations with China, Japan, Europe, and Latin America. Before we get started, I wonder if you can take us back in history for a moment and tell us a little bit about your own engagement with China, so to speak.
Sure. So I should begin by saying my first engagement with China occurred in 1963 when I went to graduate school at the East-West Center in Honolulu, and I met a nice Chinese girl who became my wife. And we're still married.
Wow.
But then I was in the Reagan administration in the early 1980s as counselor to the Secretary of Commerce. And in 1982, the United States conducted its first trade mission to China. And so I was one of the leaders of that mission. We took, with the Secretary of Commerce, we took about 40 American businessmen to Beijing, and we were discussing trade issues, how those businessmen could establish themselves in Beijing. Some of them wanted to sell their products in China. Some of them were interested in producing in China and selling back to the U.S. At that time, there were no rules. There was no WTO. There was an organization called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. China was not a member. So there were no rules governing trade or investment between China and the U.S. And our mission was to begin to establish a framework for economic collaboration between China and the U.S. I remember very clearly that trip because it was a tremendous revelation of the situation of China. At that time, 1982, it was a very, very poor country. There were no vehicles. Only vehicles were bicycles. There were no stoplights in Beijing. The tallest building in Beijing was 10 stories high. It was clearly, I was surprised. I was very shocked, actually, at the poverty of the country. We stayed at the Diaoyutai, the state guest house. We were welcomed very generously. And we had very, very productive and useful discussions. And that really began the era of economic collaboration between China and the U.S. And it began China's rapid economic growth and its rapid rise to becoming now the second largest or maybe the largest economy, depending on how you count, in the world. That trip, the tone of those meetings was very friendly and very business-oriented. You know, people, neither side was talking about politics or philosophy. We were just talking business. It was very oriented towards creating something constructive, and I think we did.
I see. And that sort of brought us to the next topic of the day, which is China's acceptance into WTO, an important event for the country. In your recent book, The World Turned Upside Down, America, China, and the Struggle for Global Leadership, you reminded us of this episode when the United States was going to bring China into the WTO. The then USTR and Trade and Commerce leadership told the Congress that by bringing China into the WTO, we would dramatically rebalance the trade relationship with China, and not just that, with China being a market economy, democracy sort of will come hand in hand. And that prediction didn't really realize. So looking back, how did we get it so wrong? And what was so, why did we fail so miserably there?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that there were 2 or 3 major factors. The first was that we had, in 1982, when I took that first trip to China, we were still in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And through the 1980s, China's economy grew rapidly. And if you try to put yourself, you're too young to put yourself back in that time, but if I put myself back in that time, you know, when I was in China in 1982, every single person in China was wearing a black Mao suit. Everyone was riding a black bicycle. So we were still in the era of Mao Zedong, and that had been a tremendously repressive threat in Chinese history. And through the 1980s, that repression was relaxed. And so it looked to the outside world as if China were becoming more liberal, more open, and it was in many respects. At the same time, the Soviet Union was weakening, and in fact, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And we declared the end of the Cold War. There was a moment of euphoria that swept through the U.S. and through the Western democracies, and a strong feeling that, okay, clearly now, open societies, free speech, rule of law, democracy is the wave of the future. There was a very strong conviction that that was the case. And in fact, a well-known political scientist, Frank Fukuyama, wrote a book. The title of the book was The End of History. Essentially saying, hey, you know, we've reached the last stage of human development, and it's democracy. It's freedom, it's open. So there was this great faith that free markets and free trade ultimately would result in free politics and open societies. I think a second factor was that our political leaders, or our business leaders, of course, were very interested in a rapidly growing Chinese market. They could see the potential for achieving great wealth. And so they were anxious to invest in China. They were anxious to produce in China to become part of this great economic growth. And they very enthusiastically picked up this idea of democracy and liberalization through trade and economics. And then I think a third factor was that our economists had from the end of World War II, so let's say from 1948, our economics leaders and professors had preached, that they had taught all of their students, people like me, they had taught us that free trade is a win-win proposition. That free trade is always and everywhere a win-win proposition. And in fact, they even taught us that even if your trading partner is protectionist, even if he is so dumb that he puts rocks in his harbors so that he can't accept, you know, your ships can't get in, you're still better off buying from him rather than imposing retaliatory tariffs. So there was a great faith that trade would somehow lead to political liberalization. President George W. Bush made the statement that free trade inevitably carries the seeds of democracy. I worked for a little while for President George H.W. Bush, and he had been the U.S. ambassador to China. He had a great faith that free markets and open trade would lead to free politics and free speech. Now, mind you, I think the most important factor was that we wanted it to be the case. We wanted it to be like that. Our political leaders, our economic leaders, our professors, our business people, we all wanted to believe that we weren't going to have any more Cold War, that the world was going to have reached the end of history, that we were in a new world of liberalism and freedom and rule of law. We wanted that. And because people wanted that so badly, they convinced themselves it was happening. They ignored important warnings. So, for example, in June 3rd and June 4th, 1989, students were demonstrating in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, and they were calling for freedom. And you remember, you may be too young to remember, but I remember that Deng Xiaoping sent in the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and basically shot the students. And nobody knows how many people were killed, but a lot of people were killed to put that down. Now, at that moment, that was a critical moment. George H.W. Bush was the president, and he could have taken a very hard position. At that moment, China was still a poor country. China was still highly dependent on the U.S. and the West. Bush could have taken a very tough position and cut off trade with China in retaliation for the massacre in Tiananmen Square. Instead, Bush sent his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, to meet immediately. He sent him to meet with Deng Xiaoping, and his message was, don't worry. President Bush will keep the boats from rocking. President Bush is your best friend in the world right now. Now, why did Bush do that? I really don't know. I believe it was because he himself had developed a strong affection for China when he was the U.S. ambassador in the late 1970s. But I really don't know. But that was a critical moment. And then in 1997, China built the Great Firewall to separate the Chinese internet from the World Wide Web. People today speak of decoupling, and often people talk about America is decoupling from China. But actually, the first big decoupling was the Great Firewall, and it was initiated by the Chinese Communist Party. And it was initiated by the Chinese Communist Party because the party did not want the Chinese people to have access to the press and information from the West. So that should have been a wake-up call to people in the West, in the free world, that China was not going to become a liberal, open society. But President Clinton laughed at it. And he said, ha, 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 the Chinese are going to try to control the internet. Ha, ha, ha. That will be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Jiang Zemin had the last laugh. The firewall's not perfect, but it works pretty well. And then there was the five-year plan of 2005. Talked about China becoming the leader in a variety of industrial areas. And then in 2015, there was China announced the Made in China 2025, in which it identified a range of high-tech industries like robotics and artificial intelligence and semiconductors. And the objective was for China to be self-sufficient and the dominant producer of these products by 2025. So that was another declaration of decoupling from the West. But it didn't really, there was not any recognition of any of this in the free world until March of 2018. And on March 1st, 2018, The Economist magazine, which had long been a champion, one of the main voices for free trade and for globalization, The Economist magazine cover story said the West has made the wrong bet in China. That was the first time that significant leaders in the West began to ask themselves what was really happening.
I see. And speaking of sort of crucial turn of events in the history, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Trump administration. People I spoke to, many of them don't agree with the Trump administration's many policies, but they tend to give credit for the Trump administration for finally standing up to China and confronting many of the Chinese behaviors. And as you know, Ambassador Lighthizer, who also worked for the Reagan administration, played a leading role in the Trump administration's negotiations with China. So the question is, how would you assess the Trump administration's policy toward China? Is it a success? Is it a failure?
Well, rather than success or failure, I think we don't know. I think we won't know the answer to that question for some time. But what I will say is that it was the first U.S. administration since 1982 to recognize that the reality of the relationship with China was different from the American perception of that relationship. Right. So I give Bob Lighthizer credit for recognizing that the truth of the U.S.-China relationship was quite different from the way it had been presented up until that time in the U.S. press, in U.S. Leadership. Now, what I have said about the Trump administration is that President Trump was a person who did not speak very nicely. He's not a polite person. He manages to say almost everything in an ugly way, in a nasty way. And so what I have said is that the way that Trump says everything is the wrong way. But everything he says is not wrong. So I give him credit for having recognized some unpleasant realities about the U.S.-China relationship. He or his people, Bob Lighthizer and Larry Kudlow and Peter Navarro, they rightly recognized that the U.S.-China relationship, indeed the U.S. free world relationship, the trade and globalization relationship, the reality of it was quite different than our perception of it had been. And they began to try to deal with the reality. Now, I would say that if I compare, let's say, President Biden today to President Trump during his presidency, so Trump was saying he was making a lot of true statements, but he was making the statement in rather ugly ways. Biden is making the same statement, but he's making it in a nicer way. And particularly right now, he's in Europe talking to our European allies. And whereas Trump would go to Europe and insult the Europeans and treat them badly, and so they didn't like him, Biden, they like him. And the Europeans are accepting more of the Biden administration's policy, and the Biden administration's policy is just the same as Trump's policy, but he's saying it in a nicer way.
Right. That's fantastic. And, in addition to politicians' administrations, I wanted to talk briefly about another force shaping U.S. policy toward China, which is American CEOs or Wall Street.
Right.
So, with all its subsidies, industrial policies, etc., you would imagine China not being a fair player in the business realm. So how is Beijing being able to co-opt Wall Street and, corporate America for so long and to get them to lobby for their interests? Isn't that puzzling?
That's a really good question. How much time do you have?
Give me your answer.
I can talk for a long time on this.
No, go ahead.
So let me separate Wall Street from the rest of the business world. Wall Street is a world all by itself. And the Wall Street guys, their fixation, their main objective in life is to make money quick. They want to make as much money as fast as they can. And they have convinced themselves that free and open financial markets are the magic medicine for economic growth. Now, beginning with Henry Paulson, who had been the CEO of Goldman Sachs on Wall Street back in the 1980s and 1990s, he went to China in the 1980s and established a relationship with Zhu Rongji, who was then kind of the czar of the Chinese economic growth policies.
Right.
And Zhu had a problem. His problem was that China had created a number of state-owned enterprises. And these state-owned enterprises were not just companies; they were like entire worlds. They had people had apartments, and they slept at the state-owned enterprises, and the state-owned enterprises had kitchens, and the people ate at the state-owned enterprise. It was like a world unto itself. And these state-owned enterprises were subsidized by the government. They didn't make money; they ate money. They didn't make money. And Zhu was struggling with how to restructure the state-owned enterprise. And in order to restructure them, he needed to be able to finance them. And he needed money to finance the reconstruction of the state-owned enterprises. And there was no money in China. And here comes Hank Paulson from New York. And Hank says to Zhu, "Whoa, wow, can I help you? We have a lot of money in New York. And I can help you sell shares, stocks of your state-owned enterprises on the New York Stock Exchange. You can raise your money in New York, and you can use that to restructure your state-owned enterprises." And that's exactly what he did. And in doing so, he managed to sell the shares of a variety of Chinese state-owned enterprises on the New York Stock Exchange, even though the Chinese state-owned enterprises did not meet the requirements normally required for listing. And he was able to persuade the stock exchange to ignore the elements of the state-owned enterprises. So almost any American company that tries to list on the New York Stock Exchange, its financial records have to be open to inspection by a government-authorized accounting firm. Well, these are state-owned Chinese enterprises. The Chinese government said, "No way, we're not allowing some American financial analyst to inspect our books." And Hank managed to convince the New York Stock Exchange that was okay. We'll treat the Chinese like they're special. They don't have to submit to the same regulations as American companies. And so Hank raised billions of dollars for the state-owned enterprises, and Hank himself became I don't know what he's worth. He's probably worth $1 billion himself. He made himself and Goldman Sachs very rich by helping Zhu Rongji reorganize the state-owned enterprises in China. Now, Hank believed that state-owned enterprises were going to become effectively free market capitalist organizations. Hank believed that the state would withdraw in China, and that the government and the party would allow these companies to be normal free market companies. But we know that that was never the intent, and that certainly is not the case. So, but there's a lot of money to be made in China, and just recently China has liberalized the requirements for wealth management companies from the West to come into China. So Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, Blackstone, Larry Fink, and so forth, they are rushing to China to try to manage the wealth of wealthy Chinese. And they think that they're going to make a lot of money. They probably will. And so that's Wall Street. Now, the fact that by doing this, they're strengthening the Chinese Communist Party and strengthening the Chinese economy, and indirectly making it easy for China to crush Hong Kong, or for China to conduct its policies in Xinjiang, it doesn't seem to bother them. They don't seem to have a conscience, and then they are making money. Now, if you look at the second piece of the business world, so look at companies like Apple. Apple, I knew Steve Jobs when he was establishing Apple back in the late 1970s. In fact, in about 1982, I got a call from Apple asking for help. They were trying to get into the Japanese market, and I helped them get into the Japanese market. And that Apple was, making computers and beginning to make other products. And they had their factories in California. And then in 1998, Steve Jobs hired Tim Cook. Tim had been working for another company in Texas. And at that company in Texas, Tim had begun to experiment with importing components from China. And so Tim joined Apple, and he convinced Steve Jobs that Apple could make a lot more money if it closed its factories in California and moved the product to China. Mm-hmm. And why would it make more money by doing it? Well, for a number of reasons. One reason is because American workers were being paid $10 an hour and Chinese workers were being paid $10 a month. So the wages were much lower in China. But on top of that, in America, they had labor unions. And the labor unions, of course, are trying to fight for better conditions for the workers. In China, there's no labor unions. So they could get rid of their labor union by moving to China. And then the Chinese also said, if you're going to put a factory here, we'll give you the land free. And by the way, we will, your electricity charges and your water, your utilities charges, we'll give you them for half price. And by the way, we won't tax you for 10 years. So it looked very, very profitable to close the factories in California, lay off the workers. They could go work at McDonald's or something like that, and move the production to China. And that's what not only Apple did, but if you look at Walmart, I don't know if you shop at Walmart. I don't myself, but a lot of people do. Almost everything we sell comes from China. And if I look at Amazon, an enormous amount of what Amazon sells comes from China. So all of these guys thought that they could make a lot of money, and they did make a lot of money by moving their production to China. But you eventually wind up with a situation that I'm going to use Apple as an example. So back in 2015, the FBI, the American FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, was pursuing a criminal case, and in order to solve the case, they needed to be able to get data from an Apple iPhone. And they asked Apple to help them get the data. And Apple said, no way, we are not going to help you get your data. And the FBI then went to court, and they sued Apple, and they tried to ask the court to force Apple to cooperate. But Apple refused, and so it became a long battle in the courts. Eventually, the FBI found an independent expert who could open the phone, and they got the information. But Apple never gave them any information. Now, fast forward to 2019 in Hong Kong. And as you know, students were demonstrating in Hong Kong. And there was an app in the Apple App Store called Hong Kong Map Live. So if you had that app, you could look at Hong Kong in real time. And the students were using that, and they were looking at the Hong Kong map in real time, and they could see where the police were. And so the students would go to places where the police were not and demonstrate. Well, of course, this was making the Hong Kong police very unhappy. And the People's Daily in China began writing very tough editorials about how China and Apple should crack down on the use of this app. Within 2 days, Apple took the app out of the App Store. And so what you see is that Apple is willing to cooperate with the Chinese government, not with the American government, but with the Chinese government. And why is that? Because the Chinese government has a lot of power over Apple. They can stop Apple's production line just by lifting their eyebrows. Tim Cook is a hostage of Beijing. We say Apple's an American company. It's not. It's a Chinese company. And that increasingly is what's happening to a lot of not just American companies, but European and other corporations that deal in China. And this is something that I think the Biden administration is going to have to find some solution to dealing with.
Fascinating. I mean, on one hand, it's surprising and shocking, but on the other hand, given the lure of the vast Chinese market, I guess, being a profit-maximizing American corporation, what are you going to do?
Right.
And that's actually my next question. I mean, given the status quo, what can be done with regard to China? What's realistic? Right. And what solutions would you propose?
Well, I think that what has to be done is there have to be some major policy changes in the West, in the free world countries. And I think that we have to reduce the reliance of free world economies and of free world corporations on China. Now, you make a very good point that a company like Apple is very dependent on China. It sells a lot in China. It produces everything in China, so it is very dependent on China. And because it's dependent on China and because China does not have a rule of law, so whereas in America, Apple will go to court against the U.S. government, in China, Apple will not go to court against the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. And so it's a huge imbalance of power. And you're right. As the head of Apple, your job is to make money for Apple. And so you're in this position where you need to cooperate with China. So I think what has to happen is that the United States and other free world countries, Japan and Australia, Korea, as well as the Europeans, we need to recognize, number one, that dependence on China actually reduces our freedom. Dependence on China means that one is subjected to coercion by China. Good example, you may remember last year the basketball coach of the Houston Rockets tweeted to support the demonstrators in Hong Kong. You haven't heard a tweet from any basketball team since then, have you? No, you haven't, because there haven't been any. Because China immediately stopped showing the basketball games of the NBA in China. And finally the NBA made a deal, and now they're showing the basketball games, but there's no tweets. So there's always this power, this coercion from the Chinese side. And what has to happen is that the free world governments need to counteract that coercion. And so remember, and here's an important thing that most people don't understand. A corporation doesn't create itself. A company like Apple doesn't just create itself. It has to get permission. Before you can create a company, you have to have a charter from the state. And why is that? Because a corporation is the recipient of a huge gift. The gift is called limited liability. So if you and I set up a company and we want to incorporate, by incorporating, the state says to us, okay, Lizzi and Clyde, the Lizzi and Clyde Corporation, you guys are now incorporated. And what that means is that if your company loses money, the people who lose money may be able to recover their loss from the corporation, but they can't take your house or your car or your personal savings. you have limited liability. And so it dramatically reduces the risk. But by giving limited liability, the state dramatically reduces the risk of us starting a business. But why does the state do that? Why does it give us this big gift? The state gives us this gift because it thinks that you and I are going to do something that will be helpful to the citizens of the state. We're going to produce not an iPhone, we'll produce a Lizzi phone. And that'll be helpful to the citizens of the state. But the point is that these corporations have they get a lot of benefits from the government. And what our governments need to do is to change the incentives. We need to be able to say to an Apple, okay, if you guys are going to use products that are made in Xinjiang, sorry, but we're going to increase your taxes by 100%. There needs to be a reverse pressure to offset the pressure from the Chinese government. I just said that there are a number of ideas in the Congress right now. Right. Senators and congressmen are discussing various ways to change the incentive structure. So I think there will be some changes along the lines that I suggested.
I see. Well, thank you for the proposal. Final question of the day. I wanted to talk a little bit about Chinese leadership over time. So based on what you see about Xi Jinping's economic agenda, would you describe Xi Jinping as like a historical anomaly, or do you think Xi Jinping is sort of a natural continuation of the previous Chinese leadership in terms of how they view the world and how they envision the Chinese economy?
Right. I think he's a natural extension of the past. I think the way I see it, of course, Mao Zedong, of course, led the party through the World War II and up until his death in late 1970s, and then followed by Deng Xiaoping. And Deng, on the one hand, was a more practical person than Mao. Deng was not an ideologist in the way that Mao was. But Deng believed in socialism with Chinese characteristics. And Deng proved that at Tiananmen Square. You know, on June 3rd, 4th, 1989, Deng showed us the truth about himself. And the truth about himself was that he believed in the party being the dictator and the leader and remaining indefinitely in power. Now, Deng's successors, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, were designated by Deng. They are seen in the West as more liberal figures. They're seen as very different from Mao and even different from Deng. But we have to keep in mind that they were designated by Deng. And we also have to keep in mind that it was they who built the Great Firewall. It was they who constructed the 5-year plans of Chinese economic growth. And so fundamentally, while there was a degree of liberalization of Chinese life, there was no liberalization of politics. And while many people in the West, in the free world, expected that China would do away with the state-owned enterprise, China did not do away with the state-owned enterprises. It reconstructed them and made them strong pillars of the state and of the party. We know that, again, thinking about the power of the party, the governors of every province, the mayors of every city are appointed by the party. The heads of all the state-owned enterprises are appointed by the party. Almost all major corporations have party cells in the corporations. So the dominance of the party and the doctrine of the party never went away. And now I see, so Xi Jinping is kind of the first ruler in China who did not come out of the Mao-Deng partnership. And what do we see? Well, we see a guy who I believe that Xi Jinping, I believe that he is what I would call a true believer. He believes in socialism with Chinese characteristics. For him, it's a kind of a religion. And he stresses, he talks about struggle all the time. We have to struggle. And you know what it sounds to me like? I'm a bit of a student of Christian history.
Right.
And he sounds a lot like Christian history. He's a religious person. Not Christianity or not Islam, but communism is his religion. Communism with Chinese characteristics is Xi Jinping's religion. And it's a very powerful element. And I see him as a true successor to Mao Zedong.
I see. Well, thank you so much for all the insights. It's been great talking to you. And I really enjoyed this conversation. And we'll make sure to put a link to your book in the show notes section so our audience who are interested can take a further look. So absolutely. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
Really,
Bye.
great to talk to you. Thank you.
Great to
Bye-bye.
talk to you. Bye.